Okay, so welcome everybody to the Kyiv Institute Berlin. It's a great pleasure to briefly announce and introduce this event. The Kyiv Institute, we're very committed to the Ukraine cause and spent considerable amounts of time through myself on the crisis, but we actually didn't do as many Ukraine related events as we should have. So it's particularly nice to get started with this event on economic frontlines, which focuses on Russia's war economy and Ukraine's war economy and how Ukraine can be supported from abroad. We will start with three inputs, three short presentations, starting with Yuriy Gorodnichenko, professor at Berkeley University, one of the most influential macroeconomists of his generation, and he will give a presentation or give a short input on his views on Russia's and Ukraine's war economy. We will then move on to Elina Ribakova, who is a leading expert on this crisis, a leading expert on the sanctions. She's director of international relations at the Kyiv School of Economics and also a fellow of Peterson and a fellow of Bruegel. Then I will do a third short input on Ukraine support, on Ukraine aid, building on the Kyiv Institute's Ukraine support tracker. And after that, we will have a panel discussion moderated by Polina Ivanova from the Financial Times and continue the discussion on economic frontlines. So with no further ado, I pass the floor to Yuriy. Thank you very much, all of you, for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much for organizing this event, and thank you for including me. In remarks, I'm going to give you a summary of the state of Ukraine's economy, where economy is now, where it's going, and discuss various specific aspects during the panel session. Any macroeconomic analysis start with two variables: what happens with inflation, what happens with output. And the picture here is very clear. You look at the GDP numbers, and you very quickly realize that the Russian invasion was not just a terrible shock in terms of human lives and suffering, it was also a terrible economic shock. GDP declined by more than 30% in 2022. Inflation increased to more than 25%. So this were very, very difficult times. But you also see from this dynamic that we had a phase of stabilization and recovery. For example, in 2023, the growth rate of GDP increased to 5.3%. So it's a reasonably strong recovery. There are some projections for further growth down the road. This is still very modest numbers given the size of the initial shock, but there is at least some trajectory pointing towards the economic recovery. We also see that inflation fell quite a bit. Now it's in single digits. In fact, now the rate of inflation in Ukraine is lower than it is in Russia. We'll have more discussion of this, I hope, at the panel. So we see stabilization and recovery. We see signs of resilience. So it's a very positive development. But we should also understand that these positive developments are not really saying that everything is under control and we don't have problems in the economy. In fact, these numbers mask a lot of heterogeneity across sectors and geographies in Ukraine. Some areas are much more affected than others. Some industries are much more depressed than others. Now, two things I would like to emphasize when we talk about challenges for the Ukrainian economy is that the country is running two important deficits. The first one is the fiscal deficit, roughly 30% of GDP. That's a huge number for any country, but for an emerging economy, this is a particularly difficult challenge because you have to raise resources somewhere to cover this deficit. Now, why we have this deficit, obviously, it's because of the war. Military spending is astronomical and wars are extremely expensive. And unfortunately, there is very little you can do about it because all the spending is dictated by the needs of the The second deficit, which is very important to keep in mind, is the trade balance, right? You look at the dynamics of imports here, this is exports, you calculate the difference and you see that Ukraine has consistent trade deficits of roughly $3 billion a year. Why do we have those deficits? Again, this is because of the war. Ukraine has to import lots and lots of things because it has to import the stuff to support the war effort. Now think about fuel, gasoline, diesel, and so on. All Ukrainian refineries were destroyed by the Russian attacks, and so Ukraine has to import almost all of its fuel from the rest of the world. That's very expensive. The export is low, is depressed because Ukraine is physically constrained in its ability to export its goods to the rest of the world. Right? So historically, Ukraine relied on seaports. Some of the seaports are destroyed, some are blocked, or they are partially active. We see some positive dynamics in recent months, but it's still very much constrained. Ukraine also depends on the trade, cross-border trade with the European Union, and we know we had some frictions in the previous months, and this is, again, a sin that prevents Ukraine from increasing its exports and closing its trade deficit. Now, how do we finance these two things? Almost all of this is coming from foreign economic aid. Right? You can see here, for example, that the fiscal deficit, a big fraction is covered with grants. These are mostly coming from the United States. Then we have loans, which are mostly coming from the European Union and other advanced economies. And then the rest is covered by small taxes and revenues that Ukraine can do internally. Now, what is important here is that these numbers are very, very big, and they're not going to go away until the war is over. So these deficits are going to stay with Ukraine for a very long time, and it means Ukraine is going to continue to depend heavily on foreign aid to support its defense efforts. Now, these are kind of well-known challenges for the Ukrainian economy. We see new challenges down the road. And one challenge here is that we see that Russia has been attacking energy infrastructure in Ukraine, early in the war, and then more recently, since the beginning of the year, they destroyed a huge fraction of power generating capacity in Ukraine. So as a result, Ukraine faces very severe shortages of electricity. On average, it's about 5, 6, 8%, depends on how we count. But this again masks a lot of heterogeneity, because when you have a peak consumption hour, you will have a deficit of maybe 30% of electricity. And so as a result, you have scheduled and unscheduled blackouts in the Ukrainian economy. Now, is this important? At some very basic personal level, you take an elevator and you don't know if you're going to make it because the building can lose electricity. So most people don't take elevators, they take stairs. But more importantly, from the economic perspective, this means that running the business in these conditions is very, very difficult, because you don't know if you have to show up in an office or if your factory is going to be operational. Sometimes even during the nighttime, when the consumption of electricity is low, we still face shortages. And so in these conditions, it's really, really hard to run a business. Another thing which is increasingly prominent in the data is that many businesses report shortages of workers. Right? So it's probably one of the most, if you look at military risks, it's the number one factor. Number two factor for many businesses is shortages of workers. Why is that? Well, it's because many people fled the war. They're in different countries. We know at least 1 million of Ukrainians are here in Germany. But also, we know there is mobilization. Roughly 1 million men are now serving in the armed forces in Ukraine. It's a big drain on the economy.
This is a stock of migrants.
This is a stock. This is a stock. I wish, it's not the flow. And so this is a big problem, because, with electricity, you can come up with some roundabout ways. With people, it's much harder. You can, have a makeshift sort of substitution there. And I think the only realistic solution to this problem is to think about more effective utilization of workforce in Ukraine going forward. So it means you have to use more intensively marginally attached groups like women and older people, employ them to the extent that's possible. The final kind of stylized fact I want to emphasize in my brief remarks is that businesses, households, everybody in Ukraine operates in the environment of extreme uncertainty. Now, how much, this extreme uncertainty mean in terms of numbers. This is a projection prepared by the National Bank of Ukraine for GDP and for inflation. And what you should see here when you look at the growth rate of GDP, that with a high probability, the growth rate of GDP may be anywhere between -5% and +15%. It's a huge range, right? So for a typical advanced economy, the forecast there is going to be ±1 percentage point, sometimes even less. This is like an order of magnitude more uncertainty. Same for inflation, it can be anywhere between 0 and +15%. Now, what this means in practical terms is that, if you run a business, your planning horizon is going to be maybe a week, maybe months. It's going to be very short. You're not going to plan in terms of years. And this means business decisions are going to take a particular form, which are not necessarily good for the economy. Why do we have this uncertainty? Well, obviously because of the war, but there are also sort of man-made factors. And one of these man-made factors is the flow of economic aid to Ukraine, right? So this figure here shows the inflows of foreign economic aid in Ukraine by months. And I want to use this opportunity to thank the Kiel Institute for constructing this data. It's really an amazing problem. I'm very grateful for this resource. Thank you. What you should see from this figure is that there is a lot of variation in these monthly flows. For example, you look at 2024, this is January, this is February. Ukraine received barely anything from its allies. And there is a huge increase here because Japan decided to give a huge loan to Ukraine. Okay, so Japan stepped up there. Then in May, it's not literally zero, but effectively it is a very, very small amount of aid in this particular month. Now, remember, I told you that you have a trade deficit of $3 billion per month. You probably have to have more money to cover other spending. So we're talking about anywhere between $4 and $5 billion per month in economic aid that is needed. And here you have those giant gaps here, which you have to cover. Now, what this means in practical terms is that the guys who are running the economy in Ukraine, they're looking at these numbers, and they face now a lot of uncertainty because they don't know if next month this aid is going to be around, if it's not going to be around. So in a way, this is sort of a homework for Ukraine's allies to resolve this, make the flow of aid more predictable, more stable, to make sure that there are no unforced errors on the Ukrainians. I'll stop here, and Elina will continue.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I don't have the slides, but I'll be entertaining all the same. So we also have a paper on the Russian economy. We're talking both, sort of Russian and Ukrainian economy. And I think just to follow up what Yuriy was talking about, I think it's important for this year for Ukraine not to forget that, or for any year, that it's hard to speak about military and economy separately. There isn't anymore this separation, right? If we think about the forecast for this year, many people had the forecast of 3-4% GDP growth. But because we left the opening of about 6 months for Russia to be able to bomb Ukraine, especially the energy infrastructure, that will force us to revise significantly our forecasts for this year. So it's very likely we're going to end up with 2% GDP growth, maybe less. And this is how military and civilian, or otherwise called financial sector, is all interlinked in Ukraine at the moment. Also, this big opening that we left since end of last year and throughout this year also meant that the army couldn't plan effectively. So if we're discussing about, what's happening at the front, why is it happening? It is also Ukrainian army together with the partners was not able to plan. Imagine you're running an enterprise and you have no visibility 6 months from now, how many offices you're going to have, how many pens you're going to have, how many chairs you're going to have. Then, of course, similarly, there's Ukrainian army couldn't plan anything, including also for mobilization. So I think that's why this financial and the military is extraordinarily important. And of course, then it dramatically changes our forecast. It also dramatically changes the financing need for the budget and for the balance of payments. So for this year, there seems to be the budget and the balance of payments needs are met. For this year, it's likely to have a gap of, let's say, 30 or 40 billion. That's why we have seen this sort of scrambling by G7 to try to use the sort of proceeds from Russian reserves. There is a conversation about this 50 billion of financing, which is not clear. The structuring of that is not clear to anybody. They haven't yet published anything. Supposedly, it will not prevent in the future from being able to access the underlying 300 or so billion of Russian frozen reserves. That is extremely important for Ukrainian authorities, but we don't have any details. But the reason we have this discussion is because in 2025 there will be an equal size need, about 40 billion or so, just for the budget, as Yuriy explained in terms of doubling of the military expenditure. There will be the same needs. If you look at the IMF program, for example, because bureaucrats need to make some assumptions. In the program, you have assumption of the end of the world 24. Of course, that's not going to happen. Unfortunately, actually, we do not know what's going to happen, but it's possible that it's not going to happen this year. And therefore, we need to plan for these gaps in 2025 as well. And again, this is military and the civilian economy and the financing needs interacting very closely. So this is what's happening in Ukraine. Let's talk briefly about what's happening in Russia. And you also have a paper outside that you can pick up and also download online. So Russian economy, to a large degree, as we all know very well, depends on oil exports. And the beginning of the war took some people to find out what exactly Russia exports, and some people thought that gas is extremely important. Yes, it is important, but oil products is the most important Russian export. Also, the way the budget is structured, the taxation of the oil sector is extremely important for the budget. So yes, gas, limiting Russia's ability to export gas, which also Russia has sort of limited itself by overplaying this geopolitical tool. It is important, but limiting Russia's ability to export oil at a high price is exceptionally important. So what we have there in terms of sanctions, we have oil price cap and embargo from the EU. We have export controls, basically limiting Russia's ability to import components to produce weapons, and we have other sanctions. Now, in terms of the impact on the Russian economy, you oftentimes hear, well, it's working and Russia is going to collapse tomorrow. It's not working at all and it's useless. Well, truth is somewhere in between. Russian economy has adapted relatively well to the impact of sanctions. What am I trying to say is that partially the implementation of sanctions hasn't been as effective as we would like it to be. And also Russia had certain resources that it was preparing for this war. So Russia's contraction, I'm not going to discuss here 2022 contraction. What was the size of that contraction? We have seen Russia revise the contraction to about 1% of GDP. I'm not sure how much I want to believe that number, but if you want to just compare, other commodity exporters almost experience double-digit growth. So clearly the impact of the war is there, the impact of sanctions is there, we see the contraction. Normally, if you would have seen such a large increase in the terms of trade in increase in commodity prices, oil prices, we would have seen a much stronger growth in Russia. So at least we have a contraction, we can debate by how much. However, since then, Russian economy began to stabilize, and already last year, we've seen growth more than 3%. This year, we might see growth maybe more than 2%. Why is that happening? Well, it is happening because Russia still has enough resources from exporting oil above the price cap and channeling that into budget revenues and then into military expenditure. So military expenditure is now 6-7% of GDP. It's a very significant number. I think maybe Christoph will talk about all of the European Union aid to Ukraine is about 0.1 or so or less percent of GDP, right? So Russia is spending 6-7% of GDP on the war machinery. If you look then now in the composition of that spending, we see the regions that have traditionally lacked any social lift, these regions are picking up. Why? Because you have either military production expanding in those regions, or you have substantial increase in the contractual payments that go for those people who go and fight the war, or as remuneration if somebody goes and dies, then this money goes to the families. So we see sort of a new morbid social lift appearing for people who are either willing to fight in this war or are willing to work on the military production. I don't know if I want to open the window because I see it is hot in here. No, it's
just really, really
it's loud. Yeah, it's up to you. I can scream louder.
Okay, let's try.
Let's try the window. So we have the situation where for Russian authorities now, it's it's not yet the trade-off. Is it sort of civilian economy or the military economy? At the moment, they're more or less able to expand substantially military economy, but at the same time, keep the civilian economy just about content. Why? Because they're exporting enough oil at a high enough price. So it doesn't mean to say that, you know, there are no constraints. Russian unemployment is less than 3%. We historically have never seen this kind of numbers, and no economist will ever tell you that it's possible. You know, the Russian potential unemployment is much higher than that, maybe 4 or 5%. And as a result of the constraints in the economy, we see central bank keeping interest rates at 16%, and inflation officially reported is about 7-8%. Maybe, you know, if you just focus on the basket of critical goods, maybe it will be around 20% or so, but nonetheless, you see that the central bank is trying to restrain the economy because the economy is overheating from this excessive spending on the military. If you now try to think sort of fast forward, where do we see, you know, so how do we see the Russian economy developing? The problem here is that politically, it's also becoming sort of beneficial to continue with the war. The economy is not squeezed enough on one hand. On the other hand, you're providing a social lift to the poorest regions and the poorest electorate to be, you know, while you still can afford it. So politically, it's not that at some point they're going to stumble and there will be sort of the economy will be an immediate constraint on the war. It is almost sort of makes sense. So it's almost beneficial for some of the people to vote to continue the war because now they finally have access to more resources, to better employment opportunities. Well, of course, they also might be drafted. If you talk about the draft or sort of the military draft, we have seen sort of a year more than a year ago, the times jumps. We have seen one big draft. It's never quite stopped, but Putin hasn't yet announced a second draft. And many speculated that after the pseudo election in March, we might see sort of more attacks in the front. We have seen that, but also potential announcement of the second draft. Well, rather mobilization. So that hasn't happened. We can speculate about that. Maybe it hasn't happened because he's concerned about the effect on the economy. With unemployment already at less than 3%, you know, sort of squeezing on the wages in many sectors, need for military employment. The concern is if you were to announce another mobilization, oftentimes what happens, people leave, people hide. So you not only necessarily mobilize as many people as you would like to, many people also disappear from the formal economy, they cannot show up in the job places, and that it will sort of constrain his ability to produce more for the war effort. And maybe that's why he's not going for formal mobilization. So when people say, well, Ukraine is small, Russia is large, you have 140 million people, Ukraine has 40, well, it's not that simple, right? You have the sort of the violence, the sort of female, male, sort of according to the different age groups. For Russia, between say 20-some and 40-some, actually there are not that many people for males, you know, for historical reasons. You have maybe about 20 million people in there, but then some of them already employed in the critical production for the military. Some of them are not as healthy as you would like them to be. Some of them will run away if you try to mobilize. So in reality, actually, it's not this 140 million people that the potential for Russia to mobilize is actually also much smaller. So now with that macroeconomic picture, what can we do better? So we have the oil price cap, we have export controls, we have Russian reserve assets. On the oil price cap, we have US elections. And we do have an issue that higher potentially oil prices are politically sensitive. You know, just like the gas prices are sensitive in Europe, in the US, higher oil prices are very sensitive. So what we can try to do is we can try to squeeze Russian shadow fleet from participating in this oil exports, and we can just address it more in the Q&A. We can also try to bring back more legitimate companies to oil trade and force them to check better that in fact Russian trade happens below the price cap. So there are further measures we can do to try to squeeze out Russians from selling at this high oil price. On the export control side, it has become more expensive and more difficult for Russia to access components. Nonetheless, Russia still manages to access components. There are good news and the bad news. You know, Russian military for decades, like many other militaries, have been trying to produce more domestically. But nonetheless, they complain that about 70 to 90% of their military equipment is still using foreign components or using foreign machinery to be able to produce that. So in a way, that is good news because that means we can squeeze them out more, make it more difficult, more costly to access these components. We have seen some reduction in their ability to import these components, but nonetheless, we've also seen some reports of Russia going and also accessing some of the German companies' components or German companies' sort of precision machine building tools and other types of equipment. So we can do more on the export controls. It's a combination, you know, if we go classical route, just like we did with banks and anti-money laundering, it might take us 20 years to eventually get there. Ukraine doesn't have 20 years. But at the same time, we can also do the carrot and stick approach. We can discuss with companies how to do better due diligence, how to do better processes, but at the same time, we can impose fines. So what I would definitely like to see more of in the US and also in Europe, high, not millions, you know, just to give you an example, a compliance officer probably gets about $1 or $2 million salary a year. So if you fine a company $10 million, that's probably nothing, right? That has to be a meaningful fine for them to pay attention, but that usually tends to focus the attention of everybody else if we have multi-billion-dollar fines, just like we did in banking. And finally, the discussion on Russian reserve assets, why is it important? There is a lot of discussion that Putin is going to nuke the world because of the reserve assets. Well, I think Putin has largely by now have forgotten and given up on those reserve assets. Maybe they will come up in potential negotiations, but for macroeconomic situation, these are reserve assets of the central bank. They were never really supposed to be used domestically. The general population has largely never seen it, and therefore most likely has forgotten it. Also, during 2022, Russian current account surplus was more than 230 billion. So very likely that money also has accumulated again as some reserve assets somewhere. So if we froze about 300 billion assets, they've accumulated new 230 billion assets. They're not exactly crying and suffering about this 300 billion assets, right? So why is it important, however? It is important because if these assets were to be given to Ukraine, that will change dramatically the balance of power, not just macroeconomics, but also military power. And I think that's why the Russian authorities are so determined to make sure that these assets will not go to Ukraine anytime soon. With that, I will stop and then we can focus on the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Elina and Yuriy, for your fascinating inputs. I will take a few minutes to just give a very short overview on Ukraine support, what's new from our data, what are the kind of the big takeaways currently. So where do we stand, okay, in terms of Ukraine support? And I will take 3 steps. The first is I will look back at the support crisis of 2023, basically the collapse in US aid. Then I will move on to what we learned from this episode on what is most missing on the battlefield in particular in terms of weapons. And then I will take a more speculative turn, look ahead of what Europe could do to potentially compensate for another decline in US aid, potentially after a Trump victory in November. Okay, so let me start where we stand. Okay, so this is the support crisis of 23-24 in one picture. What you can see is total aid allocated, right? This is not, in the new versions of the Ukraine tracker, we moved away from commitments, which is promised aid, pledges, and focused on allocations. Allocations mean that aid is earmarked for delivery in the short or near term, essentially, right? So the donor has said what explicitly is to be sent, the weapon type, or in terms of money, what is actually dispersed. Okay, so it's closer to this concept of delivery, but it's not the same as delivery. Okay, so allocations of aid to Ukraine. What this is a timeline from the start of the war, or full-scale invasion of Ukraine, until April 2024, which is when our data collection stops at the moment. And what you can see is that European aid has been relatively constant. So this European Union members and institutions, plus Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, UK, so this geographic Europe or Western Europe. And you can see that the US aid basically stalled from the summer of 2023 because no new package passed Congress. This is a well-known story. But just to show you how long this dragged out, this is almost a third of this entire period, is one entire year in which very little happened. And what you can also see is that there wasn't much movement in the trend of the European Union, right, of the EU aid. So little reaction there. And this explains Ukraine's predicament on the battlefield because central aid packages or inputs for the war didn't arrive as promised and as needed. This is just to illustrate the US package. So you might say, well, but now we have this very large new package passing, so we've kind of solved the problem for now. That is to some degree true, but it's important to understand that the new package is not a game changer. It's neither particularly large in comparison to previous packages, nor is it 60 billion as often put in the press or in the headlines, because about half of the 61 billion headline number actually are not destined for Ukraine. They will stay in the US to replenish Pentagon stocks. So for weapon purchases in the US, nothing of that will be shipped to the to Ukraine, or maybe at some later point, but for now, only 31 are explicitly aimed at for going to Ukraine, right? So that makes about half of the package actually Ukraine aid. And of those 31 billion, 22 billion is military aid. Specifically 40 billion for weapon purchases, which can take some time, and only, quote unquote, 8 billion for presidential drawdown authority, which is this very quick aid where basically the president can take Pentagon stocks and ship them straight to Ukraine. Okay, so a relatively small amount of quickly mobilized military aid. And what you can see is how quickly the late 2022 package, so these are kind of the new packages, the commitments, right, that passed Congress. And the dotted line is how they are drawn down, right? You might read in the press, oh, the US just sent a new package, right? This doesn't mean that there is a new aid package in Congress, but it means that the aid package in Congress being used up and for actual allocations, okay? And what you can see here is how quickly this evaporated, right? So this, within just about a year, this big 25 billion package of late 2022 basically was depleted. This means if this is a lesson for the future, that the current package, which is again about 22 billion large, will be pretty much depleted within a year. In other words, in mid-2025, we'll be back to the situation of mid-2023. And this exactly adds to the uncertainty point that both you, Elina, and Yuriy have made. So what happens if no new package comes in mid-2025? We'll be in a very similar situation as in 2023. And we've seen the consequences on the battlefield of this development. Again, to emphasize that, again, very little happening in terms of military allocations. This is the European Union now. So commitments have spiked, but in terms of actually allocated aid, there's very little uptick. And Europe, in other words, has not been able or not been willing, maybe probably a little bit of both, to compensate for the drop in US aid. And there continues to be a big gap between what is promised on paper, the 50 billion, etc., and what actually arrives to Ukraine. This is also a point that Yuriy made. To emphasize, so what did the US aid crisis or the Ukraine support crisis in a way of 2022 reveal? Well, it revealed that without the US, you have a dramatic scarcity of ammunition, right? This is looking at the various weapon categories plus ammunition for heavy weapons, okay, quantifying the amounts given by both Europe and the United States, or allocated, sorry, between Europe and the United States. And what you can see is that the US plays a very dominant role in ammunition. These are, ammunition are hard to track, so these are kind of lower bounds, but still you can see that more than twice as much ammunition has come from the US. And this is, looking ahead, this is the central problem also in 2025. The US pretty much, or has a very dominant position in supplying Ukraine with ammunition, and this is where Europe is lagging behind most. It has been more active in anti-aircraft support. So Europe has been giving more anti-aircraft support. In fact, if we look at Patriot-like systems, which are really the key systems at the moment, and we compare what was given to Ukraine or allocated to Ukraine to the stocks, pre-war stocks using IISS data, most widely cited source on weapon stocks, okay, of various types, you can see that the United States is sitting on this gigantic pile of Patriots, of Patriot launchers, overall 480 according to this estimate, probably might be somewhat higher or lower, but as of April, it had allocated only 8 of these to Ukraine, okay? Much more have come from Europe. So you can see that both in terms of air defense and in terms of ammunition, the US is really central, right? Because the European Union has already, or European countries have already given quite some of their air defense stocks, and now it would be the United States to actually deliver more of them, and both of these arenas, and also ammunition of air defense and Patriot missiles, the United States is pretty much in a monopoly situation. Okay. Okay, let's look a bit closer at Europe. So what you can see is that this is focusing on military allocations of the major European donors. And what is striking is that this is billion euros over time, again, from 2022 to 2024. And what is striking is how much the Nordics, the 4 countries, Denmark, Finland, Sweden, and Norway, have given. They have given more than Germany, which has picked up its support starting from mid-2023, but they are still with a population of about a third of Germany and a GDP of about a third of Germany. They are giving, they have allocated even more aid. So they are clearly in the lead, followed by Germany and the United Kingdom. The data for Poland, Italy is somewhat incomplete. France has gotten better in terms of transparency. So this is taking a bit with a grain of salt, but you can see that the distance to these other major weapon producers is quite large. So even if there was some portions of this of Polish or hidden Italian aid that we don't capture, would be still far from the level of these other countries. Okay, and this large heterogeneity can also be seen in the next slide. No. This is I have 2 more slides. It's tricky. Can you just use this? The arrows? Yeah, great. You can see that there's, if we place military aid, so before it was in billions of euros, now we can place it in % of donor GDP. How much was the military allocation? How does that look like? What is the resulting picture? And what you can see is that the Eastern European countries, particularly the Baltics and also Scandinavian countries, are most active with a donor allocation of about 1 to 1.5% of GDP, and that's total. It's not by year, right? And then you see quite a bit of the gap if you move to Western Europe, and particularly if you move to Southwestern Europe. So there's lots of.
This is over the whole period.
This is over the whole period and placing it to 2022 GDP. Exactly. So if you place it by year, you can divide by 2.5. So compared to, say, what we mobilized for Corona or what we mobilized for the energy crisis of 2020 domestically, this is a tiny amount, right, what has been allocated to Ukraine. It's not that we're talking about unheard international rescue efforts. This is actually quite small, also in comparison to previous wars in which Europe has been, or the US have been involved. We have more on that in our paper on Ukraine. So in other words, if everybody would be giving as much as the Scandinavians or the Baltics, Europe would be able to cope much better with a potential US aid drop. That's a key point. And more generally, we see that this is a defense spending in % of GDP over time. And what is striking is that Russia, as you pointed out, is in full war economy mode, right? We're now past 6%, and only very few Western countries have reacted. It's basically Poland and some Eastern European countries where you see a notable uptick in defense spending, whereas, in most Western European countries, quite little has happened. I mean, there is an increase, but far from what we've seen in Russia and Eastern European countries. So Western Europe, in other words, has not reacted to Russia's arms race in terms of defense spending or military production. So to
So what's the
conclude,
military spending in Ukraine? In the
Yuriy should know that. That's what 30%.
It's like 30%. And the reason is because GDP collapsed, right? Or why is it?
Because Ukraine is so small.
Yeah.
It's a much smaller country.
Because Ukraine is like what is it, a fourth of Russian GDP, and therefore they have to
Tense.
tense.
It's like 160 billion US dollar versus 1.6 billion. No longer.
It's much larger in GDP.
I think it's both, right? Spending went up and GDP went down. So
So to conclude, one key point is really uncertainty. I share this view very much with Yuriy. The US aid package is not a game changer, and the big question, what comes 2025, how will Europe react, right? What will happen in the US and how will Europe react? And if Europe would be willing to, prepare for a potential reduction in US aid, probably there needs to be a focus on two things, amongst others. I'm not talking about the reserve assets now, that's another option, but certainly two key steps would be an increase in the arms production. So we are only seeing timid steps. What the European arms industry is currently doing is just replacing what has been sent to Ukraine rather than preparing for potential future aid allocations of military apparel and weapons, right? So there is a very slow reaction, and production is far from full gear. And the second key point is that Europe will have to continue to play the financial aid provider to Ukraine, probably on a larger scale than it did thus far, and do so in a more stable way. So we are seeing that on that front as well. So it needs to at least stabilize its financial aid, or maybe potentially increase it, but could substantially increase the military aid it could possibly allocate in 2025 and afterwards. Thanks very much.
How should we do this? Should we just
Yeah, we'll just move from shares.
Thank you.
Those and my perspective on all of this is I come from, I rely on the work of these brilliant people so much for their data-led approach. I, as a reporter, take a more bottom-up approach, looking at whether, looking at the ways in which ordinary people are responding to these changes. So a focus, for example, lately for me has been on what you were describing in terms of the transformation of the Russian economy and the lift that is happening, the social lift that is happening in certain regions, and speaking to people who work on the factory floor and how they're feeling their salaries are changing, how they're feeling the labor shortage. One of these kind of amazing, strange consequences of this war is this sense of kind of almost an equalization that's beginning to happen within a very, very deeply unequal society in Russia, which is a kind of strange product. One person who works in this kind of job in the defense sector in a very poor region of Russia described it to me, and he's opposed to the war, described it to me as a kind of you want to laugh and you want to cry at the same time, because my salary has tripled in the past year alone, and I'm living much, much better than I used to. And at the same time, his uncle had just been killed in the war a month earlier in fighting. So this was this kind of strange transformation of the Russian economy. But something that, and I also, what resonated very much is the way that you were talking about how this kind of transformation builds in the war into the Russian economy in some way. It makes it sort of structurally kind of hard to come back from. But what I want to talk to you all about, I guess, maybe starting with you, Elina, is just how sustainable is this spending spree, even from a Russian budgetary perspective. You were talking already about the risks of overheating and how that is constraining the efforts, but how much longer? I guess this is a question I get asked all the time, so I'd rather someone else answer it. How much longer can this keep going?
Well, first of all, I'm going to apologize because I have an allergy, so no need to exit the room. It is an allergy, but so I apologize for the sniffles. But in terms of it's endogenous, right? We're all economists here. Oftentimes we do get asked how much longer. Well, it depends also on us, right? If oil price were to drop tomorrow to 40 and stay there for a year, it will be over. So the war most likely will be over. The Russia's ability to spend on the war will be over. As we know very well, but Russia doesn't do well with crisis that is driven by the low commodity prices. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to generate that with the oil price cap or other measures. What we are more likely to see is this sort of disconnect of the war economy, which is expanding, and then possibly trying to squeeze out the civilian economy. So you will see maybe rates staying higher for longer, or inflation increasing, or maybe a marginal pressure on the ruble because people are trying to import more than they are producing domestically. So I think these are the pressures. I mean, intuitively, it's correct. Early on, I got questions. Oh, how high is Russian inflation? It's going through the roof. No, it's not. But the intuition is correct. If we were to truly remove Russia's ability to export oil, and it would try to continue with this kind of expenditure, we probably have to print money, the inflation would have to go up, and the ruble would have to react. But because one piece of the puzzle is still there, we haven't removed this oil proceeds, that's what leaving Russia room to continue. Can it continue to double their expenditure next year on military? No, it won't be able to do that. But some sort of gradual increase in military spending is possible. We also see visits of Putin to countries like North Korea, right? It's not just for good, jolly old Stalin fun, kind of that they're doing that. It is possible to get equipment, or rather ammunition because it fits the Russian military production. But maybe also in some cases, it's either getting the workers or maybe investing domestically in those countries to produce more because Russian military factories already do not have enough workers. And I think also CEPR has published in the past this industrial zones like Alavoga, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, but basically they are looking for external people to come in and work. And of course, after the attack in Crocus shopping mall, their anti-migrant sentiment also makes it harder to import this labor. So the cracks are there, but Russia can continue at this pace for another year or so with this oil crisis.
Mm-hmm. And in general, we talked at the beginning, as you were saying, at the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we talked about the prospects of a possible collapse of the Russian economy and this sort of thing. And now the sort of long-term picture, as you mentioned in your report, is just reduced growth to 1%. So a country that is suffers from lack of investment, cut off from technological advances. But how gray is that picture of Russia's future? And is it gray enough and sort of, how its kind of laggard nature, is that strong enough an impulse for it to change the calculus in the Kremlin about the war?
Okay, many questions in one, right? So first, the way I think about the impact of sanctions is that you have 3-6 months. And all those sort of measures put together, there was a chance of driving the economy to this negative feedback. And it was Russian authorities themselves who were forecasting -8% as a moderate scenario, because they didn't know that they would cope with it so well. They didn't know that it would take us so long to take the measures. The measures on oil we did not take until early 23. I mean, we took them, but we didn't implement them. So what happened in 2022? We gave Russia more than $100 billion because of the higher oil price and higher commodity prices. So they said, thank you very much, spend it on the military. So it's not surprising that they didn't feel the pressure. But generally, you can have with the sanctions a shock, disorient the other party, and then maybe 2, 3, 6 months down the road, there will be some sort of stabilization. Over the very long run, of course, it also continues to weigh on the Russian economy. There is no, as we'll show in the paper, there is issues with labor, there's issues with productivities, there's issues with investment that will continue to drag Russian economy down. I think it is severe because if you think about the last sort of since the early 2000s when the President Putin came to power, what has happened to the Russian economy, right? So we had 2000s, we've had oil price of 13, it goes up to 130. So it's a huge increase in prices, right? That sort of economy goes double digits, real wages go double digits, it's also actually all very wonderful, right? Then we have the global financial crisis, the collapse and recovery, and then you never see growth again. It's really sort of very tepid small growth. We have a period between 2000, sort of post 2008 until 14, when it's a credit-driven growth. They realize, okay, that doesn't work, so they pull back on that. Then again, you have the shock and recovery, and it sort of dies. The growth dies. I mean, if you can forecast zero growth, that's what you can forecast for Russia. And of course, with these measures over the long run, again, it will continue to drag it down. Does it have an immediate impact on the war? No, but it is still it is up to us to make measures more severe.
Okay, understand. Yuriy, maybe I could ask you also the same kind of sustainability question. I mean, you gave us a picture of the Ukrainian economy right now in this moment, and obviously it's affected, as you said, by the amount of foreign aid and the reliability and predictability of foreign aid. But in general, what is your interpretation of how long Ukraine can sustain this situation?
With aid or without aid?
Well, let's say with a predictable aid flow.
I think, if this current level continues, it can be a very long time. If the aid stops to flow, then it will be more difficult. But I think Ukraine tries to be ahead of the curve now. They try to raise more taxes internally to make sure they have resources to pay soldiers and cover basic government services. When you look at the level of spending we have today, government spends astronomical sums of money on defense, but this is not the physical limit. If you look at the experience of World War II countries, in principle, you can go to much, much, much higher fraction of GDP that is dedicated to the war effort. So, as Elina said, everything is endogenous. It's not like you have a predetermined course and we're going to literally run out of money or weapons in a particular day. The one lesson from the war is that everything is so dynamic. When US reduced the flow of military aid, the character of the war changed. Ukraine started to rely more on drones rather than on artillery. For some reason, US decides again to stop the flow. Again, when we see another technological change in the character of the war, and maybe Ukrainian forces are going to rely on something else to continue.
Understood. Does anybody have questions? Do they want to jump in straight away? Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This is really, really interesting. My name is Susan Stewart. I work for the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, SWP, here in Berlin. I'm not an economist, so actually I have 3 questions. 2 maybe more to Yuriy. I mean, one thing that we haven't spoken about is the so-called Ukraine plan, right, which Ukraine has now come up with in order to access the financing that's coming from the EU from the so-called Ukraine facility, which is this enormous plan with strategic and technical elements of reform. And I would be interested, I mean, on the backdrop of what you just told us about the Ukrainian economy, how realistic do you see this plan as being, or are there sectors that you find particularly realistic in terms of the reform ambition and some that you find particularly unrealistic? And the second question to you would be, you mentioned in kind of a half sentence the question of the geographical differences across Ukraine in terms of economic development in the wartime situation. Could you say something more about that? Sort of what is happening? What are kind of the changes in the economy that we're seeing that are a result of the war? And there are a lot of industries now relocating in central and western Ukraine. Is that likely to be permanent? That would be very interesting. And I have one question to you about the support, because you mentioned a couple of times about it depends that Europe is either not willing or not able to provide more. But I think it's very key to determine whether it's not willing or not able, because if it's not able, then sort of all the demands and push to do so is not likely to be very fruitful. And in particular, I mean, you showed that it's the ammunition area where Europe needs to kind of step up, especially if the US doesn't come through. So, I mean, it seems that area is particularly problematic. Like we have the Czech initiative to provide this as ammunition, but at least what I've heard so far is that some of that ammunition that is being provided is actually not functional. So if you could just say something a bit more about, is it possible to say more about to what extent is it not willing and to what extent is it not able?
I can start, the geography is very clear. The rule of thumb is that if you're within 30 kilometers from the front lines, this is a very unsafe area because you can get a shell or rocket missile at any time. So this place is extremely dangerous. As you move further away from the front lines, it gets safer and safer and safer. But frankly, no place in Ukraine is entirely safe. Right? So you think about Lviv or small cities near Lviv, you still have regular missile attacks in those places. So here sometimes recently, there is a discussion that the Ukrainians should pack and go and live in Western Ukraine because it's so much safer there and cheaper. It is certainly cheaper, but I'm not sure it's very safe. And for people who didn't have an experience of the war, it's really hard to understand what it means to have an air raid and spend some time in a bomb shelter. The Ukraine facility is $50 billion, or euros, I should say, but it's spread over 4 years, so it's roughly $12.5 billion per year. Now, the need for Ukraine is about $150 billion per year. So the Ukraine facility is covering maybe 10% of what is needed. You have to have resources from somewhere else, maybe from the US, maybe from Japan, maybe from the UK. Somebody has to come up from with the rest of this money. One valuable thing about the facility, however, is that it has a lot of conditionality that helps the Ukrainian authorities to stay focused on the reform process as well, because we all hope that at some point it's going to be a big reconstruction stage. Significant funds are going to be available to Ukraine, and we want to make sure that our software, so to say, institutions and the like, are ready to process this money effectively without corruption, without creating a new class of oligarchs. And so in this sense, this Ukraine facility has a very important role because it has a very clear schedule of reforms that have to happen in certain days to receive the money. The reforms are extremely ambitious. You have to have like 400 reforms. I can't remember the exact number, but it's in hundreds. And we will see if Ukraine can deliver on this. But as I said, the conditionality aspect makes me optimistic that something like this is going to be accomplished.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this excellent question. So let me draw a parallel to the Corona crisis. So in the first year, it was very difficult to vaccinate people because there was no vaccine and just, we weren't able to react medically to the situation. After a while, it was a question of willingness, right? How much you would, which factories you would set up to produce this vaccine, how you designed the contracts with suppliers, and the exact same thing is true for the weapon industry in Europe. We have, it's a continent with among the strongest weapon producers in the world, right? We're talking about Germany, France, Italy. These are military export powerhouses. What has happened during the Corona crisis hasn't happened in the military domain. So in the short term, we are not able maybe to provide those ammunitions because we haven't produced them. But the question of what we can produce in 25 and 26, that is very much a question of willingness. We have both the capacity to ramp up our weapon productions in Europe and easily doubling in a couple of years, of course. I mean, if there was the will to do that. I mean, look at other wars, right? We had, think of World War I, we had a complete blockade of all sorts of commodities, and we still ran the production of weapons in an incredible pace. The same with the Nazi. I mean, these are unpleasant comparisons, but it shows that countries when they really want to increase weapon production, they can easily double and triple things if the raw materials are there and raw material access is not currently the constraint like it was in World War I. So in a way we are, or World War II, so in a way we are in a much more, it's a much easier situation to react. It's about finances and political will. And it's a bit late now to say we didn't know in 2022. So I would say at this point, it's very much about willingness. And we have been quite slow. It's time, to take a more normative stance, it's time to change that, right? And shift into willingness mode.
Yeah, but this is not going to happen until November, because after November, if Trump is the new president, this issue will come up very, very soon. And Europe is not going to be able to increase the capacity within a half a year. I mean, how should that happen? So I think it's a really big issue.
Well, I can give you a counter example. Ukraine ramped up military production by a factor of 10 for many, many weapons which we didn't produce before ever.
Yes.
And so if you can do this in Ukraine, I mean, I understand the circumstances are different and the pressure is much, much higher. But, I would argue here that it's not 2022 when we started. We should have learned that, something that's happened. You should go further back in time and look at 2014 annexation of Crimea. And you should ask yourself, well, at that stage, many politicians should have understood that we live in a dangerous world and we should prepare for, some very bad eventualities.
And it's also about creativity, right? The Czech initiative is just one example. If you have enough, you can put enough money on the table, just like in Corona, you can buy lots of weapons, just like you could lots of vaccines. Most of the vaccines flow to advanced countries because this is where the money was, right? This is at the moment, again, it might be a selfish step, but if Europe could certainly ramp up its purchases from a Trump administration, from the US, it could ramp up imports from Korea and other weapon producers. So I agree with you to some extent, right? Maybe Rheinmetall can't ramp up as quickly, but I mean, it took to get those. I mean, there is production capacity in Europe and there is import capacity too. So it's really about, so the willingness is a broad concept. Be creative, and if Europe was as creative as Ukraine, we could probably times 10 increase our production.
Okay,
So
just
I have a follow-up question.
Just spend some questions.
Yeah, you had your hand up first, so let's go.
Thank you. Because you've drawn the comparison quite some time now about other wars, so I wondered what were the numbers of financial capacity in other wars aside of World War I and II, which might be a bit of a guess. Okay, a war in which Germany was not involved.
I mean, for example, yeah.
I know it's hard to find, but
I think what the US spent on Vietnam was about twice as much per year. Afghanistan is about the same.
I would argue that's still a bit different because US troops were there. So is there any?
Korea, well, I mean, it's hard to find a similar. I mean, you can think.
Of course, but we're talking about Europe. Because Europe has always been a bit hesitant.
You have maybe to go back to the war in Spain, Franco against the Republicans. There we sent both sides sent numbers of weapons that are just much higher than we're seeing now, right? And in fact, generally, I mean, if you look at World War II, I know you didn't ask for World War II, but we're talking about not 12 howitzers here and 5 tanks there. What we do currently, we're talking about literally thousands of planes. Thousands of tanks. So this is like completely different.
Is a bit different.
Sure. Well, I can refer you to our paper. We have like a 10-page discussion addressing exactly those concerns.
Okay, thank you.
It's interesting. Sometimes we'll discuss Russia's kind of transition to this mass production of weapons as a sort of surprise. But I remember writing from already in the summer of 2022 were the first pieces of legislation that Russia was introducing to allow factories to work on multiple shifts. So they were doing it almost immediately to this transition. So there's a lot of time that has passed since that moment. Yes, at the back right now.
really frustrated in Germany that nobody has stopped taking parts. Anyway, I'm joking. I have my questions about. Versus policies, but because they realize they're falling behind Russia. Is there a chance that Russia
Post 2008, and they try to come up with different ideas. We forget, I mean, it's hard to forget, but we sometimes forget this is the same administration has been there since early 2000s. So there are no real new people in that administration. There's some of float in and out, but if you put like a circle of about 50, but you know, I don't know, like sort of so people, this is the same musical chairs among those people, it's the same ideas. We have seen Gref's plan, the head of Sberbank was somewhat Minister of Economy. We have seen that plan, and at some point people started just copying the previous plans. So we've seen Belarus's projects, the national projects that we were trying to do after 2014. It's within this within this political structure, it's extremely hard to grow an economy. You know, they have a problem of the resource curse to begin with. And then they also have an extraordinary centralized economy and extraordinary centralized political system. So if you're a governor or a local administration in some region which doesn't produce natural resources, what is your incentive to be anything business friendly? You get the transfers from the center, you get responsibilities from the center, you get political appointment from the center. So you have absolutely no incentive to grow the local economy. You know, in a simpler sort of corruption cases in other economies, you generally have to grow something first before you can steal it, right? But in Russian case, you don't even have to grow it anymore because you are dependent on the center. So it's fiscal centralization, political centralization, and then on top of that, genuinely difficult situation of the resource curse. And we know most countries that don't have institutions like Norway, before they discover resources, it's extremely hard to climb out of it. So no, I don't see how they can come up with a new creative solution of growth. And as Polina pointed out, it is becoming structural. So even if you think about pricking bubbles, you know, Greenspan or somebody else, you know, when you are having this, there was obviously a property bubble, but here you're having a military bubble. Do you want to be that politician who's going to prick it? You know, not necessarily. You sort of keep on going with it. So I think it's going to also self-reinforcing capacity economically as well.
I don't think any external neighbors will start taking that.
By largest buyer from Russia. I recently went to a conference in China on the global financial architecture. How many times Russia was mentioned there? None. So China is China. China was worried about China. China is worried about the US. Russia was not even mentioned there a single time. So yes, it is convenient. Yes, maybe they get cheaper resources. Yes, Russia maybe competes with Saudi in terms of providing oil to China, which might create an interesting opening there. That's as far as Russia goes, right? Then you have India, which is potentially a US partner and also worried about Chinese strengths in the region. So it has maybe its own interest. But it's not clear which of these players will be interested enough in doing anything with Russia at the moment. And Georgia is not going to be the solution.
You had a question to follow up on.
Just a very tiny actual follow-up question. What's your analysis of the unwillingness in Europe? Is this lack of political agreement about what should be deprioritized in terms of spending? Is it popular pressure not to do some countries have genuine fiscal limitations?
I mean, it's hard to speculate and look into the heads of decision makers, but I mean, part of it is just, I think, lack of experience with these kind of situations. Right? We've forgotten how these kind of great rivalry or war situations work. Many of the people of the 70s and 80s who were doing this day in, day out have retired. And we've learned that pretty much the entire country came together during Corona, focusing on this one issue. So there was lots of activity in that crisis. The same was during the Euro crisis, and I guess there's maybe less of a sense of urgency. We're talking about the size of this crisis. So in that sense, there's some complexity in Europe, especially in Germany. So there's that's my interpretation. Neither the public or parts of the public and parts of the policy makers do not see the need to react as drastically as in these other crises. Of course, fiscal constraints. We live in an age with many crises, climate change, aging, growing public debt. So the trade-offs are hard. They are hard in any war, but they are also hard in Europe at the moment. We live in a society with very high consumption levels and social services. Cutting back on those is not something you do lightly, right? So there are these constraints in terms of political economy as well. So even if you saw the sense of urgency, it's politically costly to move in those steps, because if you really want to ramp up weapon production, it has to come to a large degree from the public sector, right? Either directly by giving money to Ukraine that then orders in Europe, or straight orders from the government for the purpose of sending Ukraine. And that, of course, means financial commitments, money, right? And we see that across Europe, the budgetary fights are just getting more tense. So that does certainly not help. But again, I think much has to do about there's some complacency, and I think in my view, there is an underestimation of the risks and the potential costs of this complacency, of this passivity that we're currently having. What we're giving to Ukraine is tiny, probably, in comparison to what the war so far has cost Europe. There's work by research at the Kyiv Institute showing that wars are spill over in terms of costs to neighboring countries. The closer you are, so Germany is rather close to this war. It has suffered. There's less investment in Germany, quite likely as a result. There's less economic activity. So the cost of that, the cost of this ongoing war, is likely much higher than the 0.2% or whatever we're giving to Ukraine costs us in terms of fiscal. So it's a complicated situation, but in the bigger picture, it would probably be wiser to behave differently.
Maybe I'll just add to that. I think there is a sense of complacency and hope that somehow it will pass quickly. Because not only we're not increasing production, there are different engineering reasons why it might be challenging. European and American companies are continuing to supply Russia with the components. And that's it, it's up on our companies to clean up their shops, to stop doing that. There are our companies that they know it doesn't look good. So they change the name of the Russian subsidiary to something more neutral sounding, and then they supply it via Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, or China. So it's clearly willful, sort of there are different degrees of legal. So the companies think, well, we'll continue to make some money, we'll continue to have engagement with Russia. We deny it. The regulation doesn't always catch up fully with the authority's ability is not always sort of 100% to be able to track them, even where the regulation exists. And a couple of years down the road, nobody will bother us about it. So yes, we have absolute willful, continuous engagement with Russia of Western companies, including for military components. And FT does great reporting, where other institutions will continue to do reporting, where you can even link some of those components to specific murders in specific towns. And companies say, we do not know, or they say, well, we cannot possibly track. But people who work with logistics, they know that you can track if you're sort of motivated enough to put the internal procedures to be able to do so. And you've seen in every European package, they're trying to do more and more and just trying to squeeze it out. But I think the company's thinking is that it will pass soon enough and nobody will sort of pursue it.
I mean, the newspapers have a very important role in this. The financial publication about the Raiffeisen Bank, which is the Austrian bank that still does business in Russia. And basically what you have to do is to make this public and blame these companies. So these companies lose reputation if they continue to do the business, you see? And that kind of blaming, putting them up into the public And I think this is a very important way of.
Kyiv School of Economics has a huge program called Leave Russia, which is a very useful resource, which you can just, very digital, very, where you can go in, check a company and see whether it's promised to pull out of Russia, has acted on it, hasn't acted on its promises, and where it sits on that line. It's a very useful resource. But yes, everybody has a lot of work to do on that front. Yeah, at the back.
Yes, please. Could you please update?
Maybe I'll start with my colleagues want to add. So there has been a significant improvement, and that's why you see some of the improvements in the exports from Ukraine. And I think this is partially, to a large degree, is a military operation. So at some point, Russian military understood that they continue to hit Ukraine, they're going to lose as much, and that sort of created this weird balance of power where they're not motivated enough anymore to hit the ports. And sometimes you see the rockets going to Odessa, but they're not going to the port. So I think it's to a large degree, it's a military solution which opened the sort of the Black Sea to be able to continue to export. You've seen the early deals, which Russia then sort of, one would say Russia sabotaged, maybe somebody else will say something else, but so deals fell apart, and then there was a military solution, sort of, I don't know correctly to say detente or something, or some sort of, the battlefield solution was found to stop it. I don't know if my colleagues want to comment.
I think one lesson from this experience is that Russia was saying this is a red line. We will never allow Ukrainian shipping to happen from Odessa to the rest of the world. In the end, it was, as Elina said, a military solution. In Ukraine, nobody cares about what Russia is saying. We just have to do it, and we are doing this. And so whenever here in Europe, people are concerned about, but Russia will do something in response. They have a red line here and there. I think it's an utter nonsense. You just need to do what you have to do. And frankly, Russia has very few responses to the West or to Ukraine to protect shipping lines or broader economic activity.
And I think it's also important to think about sort of cause and effect, and you can go far in history, but oftentimes I hear, because of sanctions, food prices have increased. Like Ukraine used to supply a lot of countries with different food products. It's at war. That's why the food prices increase. The sanctions are not even targeting anything related to food. So I think there is oftentimes a lot of confusion. I mean, Kharkiv is getting bombed because Kharkiv is getting bombed, not because Ukraine has done something X, Y, and Z. So I think that's on this red lines and responses. Or for example, there's a conversation where Russian authorities said that one of the concerns is if we were to take over frozen assets, then they will go after foreign companies. Foreign companies, those largely have left. Those who could leave, they've left. So there is no more even business of companies really leaving. Those who are stuck, they're properly stuck, and they need to write off those assets. So it's not that Russia will start. Russia started on day one, and if you look at the legal changes, if you are sort of a foreign executive director on the board, basically your vote does not have to be taken into account. There is a whole list of legal things that they have done immediately from the beginning of the war. There was the announcement of unfriendly nations, and then you can take over those companies. Well, Putin has to sign the permit for certain types of companies to leave. So it's not in response. That already happened a year and a half ago. So you cannot shift the timelines. Now you can take over the reserves. They're going to go after companies. So I think in that sense, some of the Russian propaganda has been extraordinarily successful in sort of changing the timelines.
Yes, here, yeah.
Yeah, I have a short question on the data, Christoph, that you showed. Why is there such a, in my view, artificial split between military support and financial support? Because I mean, defense is a core government function, and the IMF always looks, which is very important for calculating budget gaps and so on, only looks on the financial side, as if the military side doesn't exist. Even so, without the military side, I mean, you don't have to worry about the financial side, right? So why is that for political reasons, or why this reporting is done in such universe?
I think we can answer what Elina said earlier. Economists are not used to incorporating security aspects very much. And again, this is about the unlearning. Right? In the 80s, it was very different. So I think, maybe staff at ministries of finance and international organizations dealing with financial issues, they're not,
One thing I wanted to add to what Christoph said, that Ukraine receives economic aid. That's true, but it cannot spend economic aid on anything military.
This is exactly my point, which is stupid, because at the same time we give Ukraine money to spend on non-military needs. At the same time we give them tanks and whatever, which is
part of this, how the money is channeled into Ukraine. For example, economic aid to Ukraine through from the US is channeled through the World Bank. World Bank says we are not involved in anything military. The same is true with the IMF. And many organizations are like this. You have also neutral countries like Japan, Korea, Ireland. They say we don't want to fund anything military. You can pay for healthcare, for education, and to some extent money is fungible, so it's not important. But occasionally you find this constraints binding, but they should take a chunk of economic aid and spend it on something military in Ukraine because we have a surplus there, and we cannot do it. That's why Ukraine has to raise taxes, because internally we have to shoulder a huge chunk of military spending by ourselves.
There's also the Bretton Woods institutions. They have many countries on their boards, right? Russia is a very bad, the big board member. There's a lot of votes. You have other countries, China, obviously. So, and the IMF programs goes through the board, right? And we also, just to carry over this, the economists who made their careers over the last 20, 30 years, right? Our perception of political risk was the risk of foreign investors losing their money in a developing country. That's the very oversimplified view of the world. And the IMF says, look, we don't have it in our charter to think about geopolitics. The closest they've come to it is this fragmentation report, which they wrote a year or so ago. That's as close at the moment they want to come to this issue, and they want to pretend that it doesn't exist. Hence, I think it's division. And so, that's just the real analysis of the board.
Sure.
I have a question for Yuriy. I read a bit late, so please excuse me if you already addressed this topic. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of latest draft measures in Ukraine and the economy and general situation in the market in terms of inflation and public situation?
Right. So the labor market is very, very tight because so many people left the country, because so many people served in the armed forces. But having said this, the rate of unemployment in Ukraine is still very high. It's about 15%. And to me, this is a signal that this labor resource is not utilized effectively. We should find a way to match people to jobs, relocate them if necessary across sectors or geography. So we certainly have this element. Now, mobilization is never pleasant, right? So, and I think a key trade-off here is that you cannot have simultaneously an economically efficient and fair system, right? So from the economic perspective, you should protect people from high human capital, high income sellers, and so on, because this is the guys who have high marginal products, at least now models. But that's not going to be a fair system, because effectively it's going to protect high income people from serving in the army. You can have a fair system where everybody has a chance to win, so to say, in the lottery and serve in the armed forces. But that's not going to be economically efficient, because you can basically poach people from some critical industry, a critical occupation, and that's not going to be efficient. I think Ukraine is still searching for a balance between these two things. And one strength of Ukraine in this context is that it is a democracy, and there is a conversation about these issues, and it's a very open conversation. We have different competing models, different proposals for how mobilization should happen. At this stage, one thing which is really not helpful is that mobilization creates a great deal of an uncertainty if your workers are going to be around for a significant period of time or they will be drafted into the army. And as a result, as was mentioning during our lunch, that some men always have to carry various documents to prove that they have a reason to be in the civilian lives in our forces. Some people don't have these documents and they are much less likely to participate in official gainful employment because they know if they show up in some radar, they are more likely to be drafted into the army. And so this is a problem, obviously. But I think there is a conversation in Ukraine now how to do mobilization in such a way that you have a balance between these different opposing forces, and hopefully this is going to be formalized. So,
if I'm not mistaken, there's a either a bill that's being discussed at the moment where businesses are suggesting that they could even offer money instead of in order to protect workers. I think it's certain sum of hundreds of.
So economically, it will be effective, protect most valuable workers. But it's not going to be a fair system.
Yes.
Sebastian Schäfer. It really seems to be public support in Europe, and we see that in the G7 there have
I think it's a political pressure from, you already mentioned, Saudi and other large reserve holders. I don't think it's about Russia necessarily. I think it's this country saying that, look, we will withdraw from key international organizations. Someone, quietly they might say, we'll withdraw from the IMF. You go this way, we're gonna, sort of leave the institution, or we're gonna exactly try to gradually withdraw from the dollar. But you're right, Russians have been trying to reduce the exposure to US jurisdiction and the dollar. But you can't, because if your large share of trade or external debt is in the dollar, it's impossible to fully remove yourself from it. And the same thing for the euro. So I think this is one aspect of it, is worry about what other countries will do rather than Russia. And I think it's back to this IMF, central banks and others who think they want to protect their own perception of what is the rule of law, right? So compartmentalizing the benefits of participating in the global financial architecture, legal architecture, right? So it's in one compartment, you violate countries' sovereignty, and territorial integrity, right? Ukraine and Russia didn't have any disputes on the territories at all, right? There are some countries where actually things haven't been fully finalized since the 90s, but Ukraine is not that case, right? 14 is, it's a different story. But before that, there was nothing, right? So it's a complete full violation of the sovereignty and integrity on that compartment. But in our compartment of central bankers, we're going to try to protect somehow the rules of the game, that there is an unspoken agreement that we're not going to touch each other's reserves, and therefore it somehow protects the financial system. So I think this desire to separate us, the economists or central bankers, from everything else, instead of the house is burning down, but in our own little kitchen, we're going to be sitting having tea. So I'm exaggerating that, but I think there's that sense. And there is a worry about unintended consequences, that one could say that, look, okay, we're worried about this. our spreads on borrowing in Europe and the US is gonna go up by X basis point for X number of years. Let's model it out and see. Or maybe we decide that it's a very high measure, we're gonna just issue debt now. Our spreads are also gonna go up a little bit by a certain amount, but we're gonna shore up this money and give it to Ukraine. But there are some people who say that, look, the spillover effects are so unpredictable, it's that we can't even quantify it, and therefore we don't even want to touch it. So I think these are the two things. One is the pressure from other countries, and I think other countries are applying aggressive pressure, and many governments just do not want to come out and say it publicly. Instead, they excuse it with something else. Or there is some also sort of genuine concern about the financial stability and lack of sort of understanding that you need to integrate into the broader policy context when you're thinking about the financial stability.
I think we'll take one more and then we will move to our less formal discussion. Yes, please.
Yes, so my name is Alexey Romaniuk. I'm a PhD student in the University of Bonn. I'm graduate of Kyiv School of Economics, and I have two questions. One of them is actually a follow-up question about mobilization. So basically, at the beginning of the year, Mayor of Kyiv and recently announced one-time payments for mobilized soldiers and like to kind of like boost labor supply of soldiers. So do you think that these measures could be effective, and if they should be scaled up, or like if labor supply function is kind of inelastic and like it so like in this monetary payments will not make a huge effect? And second question is actually about oil revenues of Russia. So today Elina discussed it a lot, and also I read an interview of Yuriy to Gorodnichenko, where you say that once Russia loses its revenues from oil, like they will not be able to continue the war, like at least long, so for a long time. And the question is, do you think that secondary sanctions would help here, and if they are realistic from the political economy perspective? Thank you.
Who wants to start?
Maybe I start with the sanctions part. I think secondary sanctions, unfortunately, are critical. And I'm glad that we have so many people here in Europe. We need to write about it. We need to think about it philosophically. Are we comfortable with it? Are we not comfortable with, we have people who say it's illegal, right? The debate has to be sort of already is open, but we need to discuss it from the research perspective, policy perspective. I was the person who thought that secondary sanctions are illegal. You should never use them. This is awful. I've changed my opinion substantially. Each policy choice has pros and cons. It works within the broader context. Maybe in this context, I'm afraid I have to start changing. I've started changing my opinion, and I think we all need to have that discussion. We sort of containing the oil market where nobody has control of a critical node. US doesn't have, Europe doesn't have. It makes sanctions implementation extremely difficult. So then we need to move to a market where we sort of still control the critical nodes, right? The 100 barrels books and others, right? This is finance. So we have to use that critical node and impose secondary sanctions. I think they can be effective both for oil market and for the export controls. Another measure there, which I think if you don't want to go, even there, you will have to use secondary sanctions. For example, OFAC imposing sanctions on the ships, I think are extraordinarily effective. But then one has to impose secondary sanctions if somebody buys those ships, because ships are under sanctions, but then we've seen them popping up again now, owned by other companies, sometimes even by mainstream Indian oil importers. So clearly they're not afraid of the sanctions. So they go buy OFAC already ship on the market. So I think, yes, we have to open this debate. There are risks. Maybe there will be a different administration in the US that will try to use it in Europe, and the blocking mechanism is not very effective. So we have to think through all those risks. But one thing I would like to say is that what I was saying earlier also with sanctions, it's better to put a lot of measures together, coordinate what is wanted on the front line, and then hit it all at once, right? Sometimes it just makes sense. Basically, you're brushing your teeth, but it's not going to save you from cancer. You need to have a sort of sometimes a shock therapy as well. So we're improving the sanctions implementation, secondary sanctions here and there, but maybe also coordination with the military action and other action on the ground and saying, okay, we're gonna put a few measures and put them together. So that's also maybe a change in framework, how we think about sanctions. I did not talk about mobilization.
I would say very briefly about this, sign-in bonuses for mobilization. In some sense, it's a great idea because you have people who are willingly join the army, and so they tend to be more motivated and understand the risks. And so on the other hand, I'm skeptical that you can really recruit very many people through this channel, right? So if we have 1 million people already in armed forces and you need probably another 500,000, I'm not sure we have enough people to do this. But having said this, Russia is doing something like this, and there is value in this price signal. Early in the war, the sign-in bonuses were relatively small. Now they increased by a factor of 5, maybe even 10 in some places. And to me, this is a signal that people don't really want to go and fight in Ukraine, and so their willingness to sacrifice their lives for Putin or Mother Russia is not as high as you see on the Russian TV channels. And speaking about Soviet collapse in 1986, just to give you a sense of how much money was involved. In the early 1980s, the oil or energy rent of the Soviet Union was about $400 billion per year in present dollars. So when in '86 the price of oil collapsed, that rent decreased by a factor of 3. And the Soviet Union was much more closed economy. They didn't really depend on technology or other trades with the rest of the world. And so the clock started ticking for them very, very quickly. In 1981, they didn't really have resources for anything. Russia is much more dependent on oil revenue than the Soviet Union. So the clock is going to run much, much faster.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, on that, on the Russian point, I think it's hit a record of 1.3 million rubles for a sign-up bonus most recently, which compared to an average salary of about 40,000 rubles a month is a big deal. Anyway, thank you so much for your wonderful presentations and for the discussion and for the great questions. And what an honor it is to be in a room of so many people thinking about the same topic. Thank you so much.
Yes,
yeah, there was much cooler, hopefully, and there's more
Yes, yeah,
over there as well. And the paper